then, you know, the first question I want to pose to the panel is, you guys all work with young people or write about and think about these issues related to the use of these of drug abuse, but not even just drug abuse. These things that are presented as harmless, you know, it tastes good, you know, you feel nice, and you know, what have been your interactions with or your thoughts on the use of these concoctions within the community and how they affect the health of young people?
Well, one of the things I talked about in my article is how drugs, sex, and materialism, especially within hip-hop, are forms of masking coping mechanisms, that the culture itself makes these different acts a cultural form. So when you think of hip-hop, it's hard to separate hip-hop from drugs, alcohol, and sex. But taken out of the context of music and art and culture and just looked at in everyday society, we would say that these are unhealthy behaviors that people are often using to mask pain and trauma and suffering. And so the art form itself makes it harder for folks to heal, to get therapy, to be in conversation about their pain and their suffering. I mean, in the context of Lil Wayne, there has to be a certain degree of trauma that comes from massive, massive success after an entire lifetime lived in poverty. And that transition is not one that rappers are taught to move into in a way that is healthy and redemptive, because oftentimes I believe there is a sense of guilt that comes with that level of success. And you hear that when he talks about Katrina and how much it touched him. So there is no amount of millions that you could ever earn that helps you forget what you've left behind. And I do think a lot of times the intake of all these drugs and these different forms of escapism are a way to forget what they've left behind. And so we're not talking about that. You know, I think we're belittling them as people who are immature in the way that they model success, when in actuality, he came into the game as a kid. I mean, he was a baby and quickly rose to a point where he's called one of the greatest rappers of all time. So what does that mean when he's in his quiet space? And I think for him, you see a lot of it played out in his relationships with women, because my most recent article about Lil Wayne was the fact that he holds nothing sacred. So it's not only that he's doing damage to himself, but if you listen to his lyrics, he's also doing damage to women in his rap lyrics. I mean, constantly talking about women's bodies as a form of pleasure for men. And even to the extent that, I mean, the most recent controversy was what he said about Emmett Till. And so I don't want to begin to bash Lil Wayne, but what I'm saying is the danger in the way that hip-hop heals is that it's often at the cost of oneself, women, and the greater community. And so if we're not learning ways to mend from that pain or that guilt or whatever it is that folks are dealing with, then how does it manifest in other unhealthy ways?
Oh, excuse me. Also, I would like to add that historically it's this myth, but some people believe the myth to be reality, that you have to be high off of something to be in this euphoric state of creativity. And so you take someone like Wayne, just for example, where he got to a point where he felt like he wasn't going to write anymore. And so the way for him to get ultimately into that space would be to get high. You think about Notorious B.I.G., and I know originally we were talking about this conference commemorating the 16th anniversary of his death being a week ago from today, and then you look in the movie Notorious, there was this scene when Puffy had given him the Juicy Fruit record and was like, yo, I need you to do something with this to make this radio hit. And he told C's, you know, get women, and I need some weed, and all this other stuff, and give me a Pepsi. And so just in that alone, that message gets put out. And so then you get young people from the unsigned to the unrhymed to those who think they're divine that they got to be out of their conscious state of mind in order to rhyme. Y'all can figure that out later.
Yeah. And then, Ian, what I want you to talk about now in response to those two things, because I think your work serves as a counterbalance, because you work with young people all the time in creating rap within the school. And so when you're doing that work with them in school, to get them to be able to get to that state where their creative selves are awakened, have you ever gotten to a point where youth are saying, this is not the appropriate context for me to be able to write creatively? And, what challenges come into play when you're trying to tell them that, no, you don't have to be high or on drugs or in this sort of, artificial euphoric state in order to be able to sort of bear your pain and put it on paper? So how do you deal with that tension?
Right, and that's a constant struggle. So what happens is often I open up the room for a hip-hop cypher, so I allow youth the chance to rap, but I usually preface those types of interactions with this whole, let's use the lyric writing process as a means to explore ourselves, as to express ourselves and develop emotionally. And I do that when I rap to them, so all of my raps are interpersonally based, and then I try to get them to do that as well. And every time that they start freestyling, when they hit a point of struggle, there's a switch where they just start rapping about girls and clothes and cars and money. And I think it's easier to do that because they hear that all the time. And that's what they're supposed to do. And so in terms of it being a coping mechanism, I think that speaks to it right there, where like they have an instance to try really hard, and it is hard, to talk about yourself and your emotions, but all of a sudden when it gets difficult, they switch into this sort of more materialistic-based types of conversations. They get angry often when they can't, use curse words in their raps. And I'm always an advocate, you use curse words if it makes sense, but don't use it just for no reason. And so, yeah, but I mean, I see it all the time. They want to slip into these modern-day interpretations of rap.
So I'm gonna push back at you guys a little. That's why I'm here, we here, we could sit here and we're at Columbia and having these conversations about the, these negative aspects of the raps and the tensions with opening up these spaces of euphoria that come from abuse or whatsoever. But I've heard and I've seen, particularly in online spaces, where people say, at Lil Wayne, send him a tweet and say, you were better when you were on that scissor. Or you were spitting for real when you were on that lean. And so, how do you, we could talk about this work with healing young people, but when we understand that the people that they are looking up to have not had the opportunity to be healed, how do you deal with the tensions of an audience that is feeding off the destruction of these iconic figures and then allowing them to create these images that young people who have no criticality just consume? So how do you deal with that tension?
I'm so glad you asked this question because in the context of mental health, I don't think we oftentimes talk about how, especially within hip-hop, black masculinity relates to our understandings of mental health. So, I mean, I personally believe that, there's a certain degree of psychological warfare that black men go through, whether it's, I mean, oftentimes mortality is talked about all the time in this music, right? And so suicidal thoughts, Biggie, I think there are conversations that they're trying to have that are informed by their everyday reality. And whether that's, the fact that a 16-year-old male could be shot by police officers in Brooklyn, and you require the community to make that matter, I mean, there's a level of warfare. So what I'm saying is that the community is in some ways trying to hold them up to whatever image it has of black masculinity. So they have to perform. Lil Wayne is as successful as he is because he built his career on his obsession with money and sex and these things that I think the culture in some ways says you have to be the kind of man that we would support. I mean, it's the same way that artists like Talib and Lupe and Mos Def or Dead Prez haven't seen the level of success as a Drake and a Jay-Z because they're not performing the type of masculinity that makes it in mainstream hip-hop. So I think if we're talking about reshifting the conversation about hip-hop in such a way that allows these artists to be who they are fully and freely, we can't do it unless we have other conversations about who black men in general can be freely. And that plays out in the films. That is not just hip-hop. So it happens in these intimate spaces. It happens in a church. I'm always talking about the Black church being the biggest form of an old boys network within America, within the context of Black America. So I think the young people see that in every realm, and they want these artists to be a reflection of that.
And also, you know, we always get off on people's demise. I mean, we could go broader than hip-hop, and I'm old enough to remember the conversations, who do you like better, Fat Luther or Skinny Luther? And nobody was considering the health implications of the Fat Luther, but people would argue as his weight went up and down that it's like, no, you know, I don't know whether more pain came across in that setting. And so when you go into hip-hop or just even in life, I think people are dealing with their own issues, and one way to avoid me dealing with my issues is escaping and seeing you deal with your pain and me almost getting off on your pain and not really making that connection or even asking yourself that why. And then a lot of times, consumers are very simple. If enough people say it, well, it got to be true because enough people said it. And so you're not thinking critically about that. And then it's almost like you take DJ Khaled. He started saying, we the best. And so he said it enough to the point where now if you say we the best, what comes to your mind is DJ Khaled. And so if you watch enough documentaries, you listen to enough lyrics where the person is saying, I'm the best when I'm this or when I'm this, then you begin to almost create that affirmation where you speak in life to it. You know, life and death is in the power of tongue. And so when you continue to speak it, it will come back to you as such.
I think this is why Dr. Wallace always says, you know, I'm just going to let it go. She's always citing, Teddy Pendergrass, so she'll always let it go when she has an obstacle. And just on that idea of you know, hip-hop as creating or developing mantras that become what those who consume the music make sense of, you know, is there a space for creating a counter-narrative through the same mechanism that creates the negative ones? You know, what potential is there for hip-hop to be able to present through the same tools that push the destruction, sort of bring more life to it? And what do you see that in, again, Ian, in your work, but then also going back around, what do you guys think?
I think there are some artists that right now are pushing those limits, and I think that's going to have a huge effect on the youth who are listening to that music, namely Kendrick Lamar with something like The Art of Peer Pressure, talking about hanging out with his homies and never being involved in violence or drug use, but then when he's with his group of people and he's within the context in which that is the most appropriate way for him to behave, he behaves that way. And I think talking about that and showing, like, opened up, when I played that for my youth, it opened up a lot of just a deep dialogue with them because they could speak about experiences they've had with those same ideas. And not to say that that's the answer necessarily, but I think that that's part, you know, engaging in those conversations critically when you have somebody who is as prolific as Kendrick and saying, he's talking about himself here, he's exploring, he's not glorifying that, he's just talking about how he went through that. Maybe we can use this process as a means to explore issues like that we've faced.
I think we're talking here to a room of folks who are in health and education. And I want you guys to speak to what you then think, just jumping off what you said about Kendrick being this person who's actually interrogating the art of peer pressure and deconstructing that in rhyme. What do you think is the potential for us to be able to use those tools or those artifacts within hip-hop for the practitioner? You know, so for somebody who's dealing with young people every day, what ways can they utilize a rap like Kendrick's or an album like Kendrick's or use a line like Biggie's that Rahil mentioned earlier as a mechanism through which we can sort of open up new possibilities for the young people that they interact with or even the adults they interact with?
Sorry, just one more thing. Yeah, I agree, and I think that cognitive behavioral therapy, if you're a therapist and you're in a room with a client, one of the main pieces of cognitive behavioral therapy is journal writing. And so if you can email the track that Kendrick did to the student and say, listen to this track, bump this track all week, and then write down your own feelings. Try to do the same thing that he did. Write your own narrative down over this track and bring it in next week, and we'll go over and we can rap it and we can record it. It becomes this platform for them to explore themselves in this very culturally relevant way.
Also, you could take same artist, same album, the song Swimming Pools. And I really like that song in particular because young people will always speak in code. And, you know, that's just what young people do. When we were young, we spoke in a code so that our parents didn't know. And so you can listen to the song like Swimming Pools and you kind of nod your head with the hook and you think that, you know, he is glorifying alcohol. He is talking about filling an entire pool with liquor, like what a hyperbole. But then when you start to listen to the verse, and so oftentimes what I'll do is give the young people the words and have them read it without listening to the music. And then now that we're living in the age of video, then it's like, okay, we're going to read it, then we're going to discuss it, then we're going to listen to the song, and you can watch the video. And the video, you know, you got the set, there's women, it's the nice pool, but I want you then to go to your neighborhood and reshoot the video and show the image of the liquor store, the alley, like really talk about what alcohol looks like in East New York, Brooklyn, and Flatbush, and this, that, and the other. And so now we're not only stimulating the sensory of listening, but we're also seeing visuals and then begin to break it down from there and then just start to identify what are those risk behaviors that are in this song. How many did you catch reading it? How many did you catch listening to it? How many did you catch watching it? And if those numbers are not the same, then you open up a door to begin to have a discussion and then begin to be vulnerable enough to bring in your music. Be honest with them and let them know that you was rocking Mary Jane and you didn't really know what it was talking about, but you just was in love with Mary Jane. And so they can understand that it's not a new phenomenon. It may be new technology, but not really a new phenomenon.
Well, I mean, the thing is, it's hard to bring it into the classroom in an authentic way if you yourself don't appreciate or value it. It's also hard if you feel that your work is in competition with hip-hop. And so I think a lot of time educators, practitioners, the civil rights generation see hip-hop as having the ear of young people, and therefore they have to pull them away from hip-hop in order to get them to listen to anything else. So I think our own personal relationship with hip-hop matters in what we carry out in the classroom. If you are every day thinking that this is destructive, that it is ruining an entire generation, you know, that this is the most unhealthy cultural form on the face of the earth, how do you think that's going to play out when you're pretending that it matters in a classroom? So, I mean, what's your personal engagement with it? I think that is absolutely critical because it's hard to challenge, cherish something that you're constantly in competition with. And I think activists, practitioners, educators are often in competition with hip-hop. So I would say that. I would say the other thing is there's the lyrics. I mean, you know, Lupe Fiasco's Food and Liquor itself is an entire conception of what it means to live in communities where you have little access to anything besides poor food quality and liquor. But the flip side of that is, say, what happens with, you know, black women's bodies in the context of hip-hop, where Nicki Minaj has said in lyrics herself that she's taken butt shots. You know, to get the body that she has. It could be assumed that she also has breast implants, right? And so beyond her actual lyrics, you have her body as a reflection of what women feel the need to do in order to make a space for themselves within this genre. And how does this lead to greater conversations about the appreciation and value and respect, and also the disparities of black women's bodies?
I just wanted, that was such a brilliant point that I really want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about just sort of image and imagery. I mean, there's been a lot of work done or a lot of discourse about the fact that many of the consumers of commercial contemporary hip-hop are oftentimes not from the communities where the music has been created. And, you know, my notion is always that there are fantasies about blackness and womanness, blackness and maleness that are long-standing, that play out in the communities that end up being those who consume commercial hip-hop. So, you know, for example, there's, you know, this notion of the black, aggressive, violent, muscle-bound, surviving gunshots image. It sort of feeds a narrative about the exoticness of the black male body. And so those who consume contemporary hip-hop then are looking for artists that maintain this perception of blackness that they have, and those folks are oftentimes suburban, middle class, and white. And the same images occur with black females. So if you know that imagery of the Hottentot exists, there's this sort of, oftentimes, a white male, suburban, affluent fantasy of what black female life bodies should be. And so then hip-hop then, in a capitalist society, starts creating forms of self that feed the insatiable lust that others have for our community. And, my question to you is there a fracture in that narrative that allows us to be able to move past images of who we should be that are not necessarily representative of who we are in our communities? I know it's a loaded question, but, do those spaces exist? And if they do exist, how do we make them more visible?
I'm going to try to answer it, but I'm going to answer it in the way that I feel is most important, and that's to say that if we don't do something about these images, we're going to continue to see the effect that they're having on our community. And so one thing that I thought about in writing this article is that there has to be a link made between mental health within the hip-hop community and mass incarceration. If we know the numbers of people who are incarcerated that are dealing with mental illness who have never been treated, there's no way that we can't connect that to the alarming numbers of African American men who are going to jail every day because of aggression, because of ways in which they're coping that are unhealthy. So these images are images that are leading us to prisons. That's one thing. That it's not simply that we're conformed in our ability to be freely who we are, but we're actually being contained and incarcerated in mass numbers because of these images. That it really is affecting how an entire generation is living out trauma, that oftentimes they're acting out in aggression and they're seeing the consequences and the loss of freedom. So, I think we often talk about it in identity, but it has a very tangible result. And oftentimes when hip-hop is glorifying mass incarceration, that you have to in some ways cross the burning sands of jail and being shot up at least 9 times in order to be, a well-known rapper, then what it does is it completely detaches any conversation about people's inability to, go to therapy without feeling that that's a reflection of who they are. So I think there has to be a space for vulnerability. How often are these rappers celebrated for talking about women in a loving and affectionate way? I think the one time that Jay-Z did that, he talked about Beyonce not wanting to focus on their relationship because she was too focused on her career. It was a song where he talked about Beyonce, Damon Dash, and everyone was like, man, I'm just going to pretend like I never heard that song. Lost One. Right. It was like, I'm going to just wipe that out from my memory because that's not the Jay-Z I know and love. And everyone pretended like that song never came out because it went against this king of swag persona that this man has built his whole entire empire on. Okay, I could go on about that.
I could tell.
Quick, you mentioned the word fracture, and so we could say in our individual communities we can make hairline fractures by broadening what is hip-hop, which goes to the point where you were mentioning earlier that, the beauty, we have an opportunity now that wasn't present when I was growing up, because now what we know as contemporary hip-hop is 40 years old. And so now you look across this panel, we're all grown and we're hip-hop. And so we get to interact with our loved ones. Like, I get to raise my children so my children can talk about their dad as being hip-hop, but it's much broader than that visual image that's being presented. And so then it's on my 13-year-old son, when he may be talking with his friends, he can talk about hip-hop from a different perspective. You think about Science Genius and going into failing schools and being able to write a rhyme about biology and DNA and just then begin to share who you are, but doing it in a manner where you're authentic and they know that you're hip-hop. They know that you didn't just get like the Chris Emdin script, like just answer these questions. Like you can go in there and speak, you know, experience, work of knowledge. So I'm going to sit down with a 16-year-old. You don't know more about hip-hop than me. And so, and I'm not doing that from a condescending way. I'm just doing it from a matter of experience. So then it just begins to make it a little bit broader. And then it's sharing with them things that's not coming through 106 in Park, not coming through the radio station. You know, you think about DJs like P. Cutto, who has mixtapes called The Art of War, and it's just like what he calls the first conscious mixtape. So he's just pulling all of these different songs that are just really going places like Lost Ones that, you know, it's like you can't, it's not cool to listen with your friends from an art of peer pressure, but you got it inside your iPod. You know, you nod into that joint. You know, you probably wrote your own Lost Ones in your journal, but it's not cool to share it with your people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to follow up that, I think it's a brilliant point. Like there are elders in hip hop culture now, and we can go and talk to youth who are in this culture with experience. And I'm in like this weird place because I'm younger and I'm from this like sort of suburban consumer culture that we were talking about, and I was raised to play classical trumpet and get as far away from hip hop as I possibly could. But now finding my own way in has been a platform for me to walk into these schools and engage with youth in this culture. And they want to talk about it because outside of school, that's all they're doing is they're engaging in this culture in some form, be it good or bad. And so just having the opportunity to bring a base of knowledge about hip-hop culture and bring sort of a willingness to explore hip-hop culture with you into the school as an educator or a counselor or as anybody, you know, I mean, that in itself can open up so many possibilities for young people.
So we have 15 minutes, and I've got a billion questions. So I'm going to stop and allow folks in the audience to, you can start coming together, and those of you, you know, getting your nerves up to ask questions to the panel. I'm just going to keep doing what I do anyway because I could talk to them forever. But in the meantime, if you'd like to come up to the mic on the left-hand side to ask some questions, please do so. The next question I wanted to ask you guys is, you know, given the visibility of a lot of hip-hop and hip-hop imagery through social media for one, but also sites like WorldStar. You know, I think it's a site that we don't talk about enough, where it's like WorldStar Hip Hop, where there's spaces where audiences from a wide array of places get to convene in a space and talk about hip hop with a certain level of anonymity. And what happens in those spaces is that the conversations become so racially tinged. I mean, I went on there the other day, and every single video I saw, there was somebody sort of spouting a sort of like maybe a white supremacist image, like this is what these N-words do. And it's like the anonymity allows folks to get into those spaces and provide messages about hip-hop that are being consumed by folks who are in hip-hop. And, you know, what do you think about the effects on the body or the psyche or the being on knowing that what you've produced that has power is being perceived by a public not only in a negative way, but in a way where you're being racialized and viewed negatively for it? You know, what are your thoughts on that?
So I was recently reading The Classroom in the Cell, which is a book written with Mark Lamont Hill of Teachers College and Mumia. And in this section in the book, they talk about hip-hop as a cultural art form that reflects resistance, but then actually the fact that it's not necessarily resistant in practice anymore. You know, so I do want to kind of make the point that, you know, we can't hold the genre up as inherently a place of resistance because we have outlets like WorldStar Hip Hop. So I think we have to be really keen on identifying arenas where progressive hip hop exists and saying that that's very different than other arenas where it's very destructive and unhealthy. And I got to a point where I just stopped. Essentially, I boycott WorldStar Hip Hop. Now, it's terrible because there are some things that you can only find on there, you know, and so, but I can't do it because so many of the videos that are taken on the streets of kids beating up other kids land themselves on WorldStar Hip Hop. And they're watching it, and they're building a whole identity around this community that's in many ways very, very violent. So, and I understand this, when you try to present progressive forms to the world, what happens to that, because the Washington Post is an interesting beast in terms of, how much racism manifests itself in those little comments under my articles, And so I've written about pop culture and race, and I write a lot about the Obamas. And you find that when people can hide behind an icon, and, I mean a serious, like, digital icon, they will tell you what they really think. And if I didn't believe racism exists, all I have to do is read the comments on my articles. And so I think a large part of it is that we create our own mediums. So I launched Urban Cusp a year and a half ago because I was tired of saying that things were missing in the media landscape, and instead wanted to introduce something new. For me, part of what was missing was the intersection of hip-hop and Christianity. That rarely do you find progressive hip-hop in conversation with progressive Christianity, which in many ways have been two of the most powerful tools within the Black community throughout our entire history. That it has been Black liberation theology and progressive hip-hop that have really been a catalyst for change. So instead of constantly complaining about it not being there, I created that medium. So I'm always talking about the need for media outlets that are created and owned and operated by people of color.
Okay, yeah, we could go back to the questions then, yeah, sorry.
So you can just continue about hip-hop and Christianity. So in the church, I just wanted you, I know that you've been speaking about hip-hop in the classroom and addressing hip-hop with the students in the classroom. I don't really know much about hip-hop, so I just thought that this conference was going to be really interesting. I wanted to know how we're going to tie health and hip-hop together. But in the church, so the young people are there on Sundays, and they have things in their ears. They have the music in their ears. I don't know what they're listening to, but how should the youth leaders address the youth in the church, because they are listening to hip-hop? I know that. So what should they do? Because, okay, take the music out of your ears, but that's not the response. That's not the proper response. The children today, or the youth today, they're totally different from the youth of 20 years ago. So how do you, or do you address hip-hop in the church culture?
Yeah, and I mean, I hope I'm not offending anyone, but I think in some ways African American churches have a very unhealthy relationship with hip-hop, in my opinion, partly because oftentimes their embrace of hip-hop doesn't feel organic, because they're oftentimes trying to construct forms of hip-hop that don't necessarily fit, because Christianity and culture weren't necessarily intended to come together. And so you have in some ways this awkwardness between the church and hip-hop, and I think it's because a lot of pastors themselves don't have a relationship with it. They don't listen to it, they don't celebrate it, so then it's really, really hard to incorporate it into your ministry. I think it's really important for those pastors to know their strengths but know their weaknesses. So if it is not your strength to analyze and dissect and critique and challenge hip-hop, then you need to bring in someone who does. And those people exist. There are people who devote their lives to looking at hip-hop as a form of resistance and connecting it to the work of Christ and putting it in a larger context of thorough world liberation. I mean, this is the work that people do. And if you don't do that work, you need to cultivate a generation of ministers that are. So a large part of what I try to emphasize is the fact that more women need to be a part of this conversation, because how are you bringing the hip-hop generation into the fold of the Black church if you haven't even brought women into the fold of the Black church? So I think that's one of the first things that needs to happen. After you've done that, I think a lot of these ministers need to step off of the pulpit and let younger people get on the pulpit. So it's not necessarily just the church and hip-hop, it's the fact that the Black church itself is male-dominated, that is patriarchal. It's in many ways seizing a hold on Black leadership in the same ways as the civil rights generation was seizing a hold on it, and no one's trying to pass the torch. And so what you have is young people saying, there's not a space for me in the church. So they don't come, because they're asked to come and fill up the seats in the pews. They're not asked to be serious members of the body of that work. And I will also say, lastly, that I applaud the Nation of Islam for their grappling with hip-hop I wrote an article yesterday that talked about the work of hip-hop activists in bringing an end to gun violence. And there's a unique work that the Nation of Islam has done that the Black church hasn't been as strong in, which is that Minister Louis Farrakhan will often sit down in private with artists and try to use that as a way to promote social responsibility. He'll sit down with gang members. And I think the church, sadly, and I'm a devout Christian who went to seminary, is a very self-contained institution that prides itself on being able to bring people in. But what hip-hop demands is that you go out, right? And so if you're spending the majority of your time trying to maintain a building fund and bring people in, then what are you doing when those people are out in the streets? You're not there with them.
Sam, I know you had to say so. As a minister.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I actually have a curriculum that I created called Lyrics and Scriptures, where I analyze the lyrics from contemporary hip-hop and then compare or contrast them with scriptures. And it's about developing spiritual media literacy, because the reality is that people, young people from an adolescent development standpoint, it's about independence. So if you're telling them not to, they're going to do it anyway. And so based upon as they're growing, and if they're growing in the faith, I just like to try to give them the tools so that they can better comprehend what it is that they're listening to. And I agree that the church misses teachable moments. Like oftentimes I will talk to pastors or other ministers, and it's like, okay, you just preached this sermon and you talked about T.I., you talked about 50 and all of them, but at the altar call you didn't pray for them. And, you know, when Christ was on the cross, he was between two thieves, and the thief acknowledged him, and he said, today you'll be with me in paradise. So at the end of the day, we're talking about souls. So, you know, if you're talking about a T.I. and you're listening to his music, there's heavy spiritual references and implications in it. And so what I try to do is empower the young people who have professed to be a Christian or whatever faith that they're in to be knowledgeable enough to have the discussion with their peers who may not be in a church setting, but listening to the music, and they could begin to fill in the gap. So I feel like literacy in and of itself is a health issue all the way across the board, whether you're talking about spiritually, whether you're talking about just the word or just being literate to your health and your body. So that's my approach. And, you know, my bishop, he allows me to do it because he knows that I'm sincere and I can. And young people, they can detect whether you are with it or not. Now, I will say one part that I have a major problem with the way that Christianity has attempted to co-opt hip-hop. I am extremely critical of quote-unquote gospel rappers and different things like that, because the reality is a lot of what they're doing is just mimicking what was secular 2-3 steps behind. And oftentimes it's sort of like you're an out-of-work secular rapper, so now all of a sudden, you know, you're representing the Lord. But that's another panel. We can rap about that later.
I appreciate the shifting gears, and it gave me also a lot of food for thought. I promise y'all I'll never be a gospel rapper, but unless somebody get a check. But I want to shift gears a little bit, because in addition to the folks here, we have a really wide array of folks online, and folks online have some questions also. So I'll take one of the online questions, then we'll go back over here.
Well, just a series of comments that came in through the conversation.
Okay.
So I'll be a little out of time, and I'll just the messenger.
Okay, that's fine.
The Black church has women too. It's not an old boys club. That's one comment. That's not true. The church has not thrown out hip-hop. There is Christian rap. There is a Christian hip-hop movement like Flame, Ambassador, and Reach Records. And lastly, that is true. If your heart is not into hip-hop, let someone else do it.
Brilliant comments from online. Thank you. So we'll go to your question.
Oh, thank you. So I wanted to ask this question yesterday, and so it's great to see you up here talking about what you do around, you know, supporting and mental health with youth. So having worked with youth and doing leadership, I was thinking about yesterday, how can you guys expand the creativity found within hip hop to provide those techniques, like developing those techniques on improvisation, you know, using rhythm, supporting exploration when you're dealing with youth who are presenting with various traumatic issues or unpacking issues, especially in the area of continuing their education, leadership, or exploring opportunities to go outside of, you know, finishing high school. And a lot of times you'll deal with that crowd of youth who are feeling that opportunity, that there's some guilt coming up for that opportunity for leaving what is, like, you know, damaging and crushing them, and then looking for someone that they can communicate with on that level. So is there any, inside of that expanding, is there any conversations with social workers in the schools, counselors, parent-teacher counselors, or anything like that to both share those skills and techniques with them and then help the youth unpack their issues inside of the schools?
So perfect for Ian, right?
Yeah. So schools are an interesting place because of the fact that as a school counselor now in a school, there isn't an immediate social worker to go to. Because of funding, there may only be one person who sort of encompasses all of those roles. Now, there is a school psychologist, but she does a lot of testing and just for IEPs and 504s and things of that nature. So, but there is a conversation, but a lot of these ideas and these theories are being developed currently. And so people need to accept them more to be able to expand into other spaces. And a lot of what comes on to bringing this to social workers and bringing this to school psychologists is research, unfortunately. There's a big need for empirical evidence to be able to apply a lot of these practices, especially when you're dealing with individuals who have serious diagnosed disparities. And so there isn't really an answer yet. We're trying, you know, it's an everyday battle to bring it and to have these conversations with people to broaden the horizons of where hip hop can be used. And so it's currently expanding.
I think just thinking about what you're saying, it would be so exciting if there was some opportunity for like continuing education for social workers or whoever who is working with youth, after school counselors, after school programs, to bring that critical view into that environment, so that there is that use of those types of, you were saying how the brain gets all excited inside of improvisation, or, you know, recognizing those rhythms. I don't know if, since you guys are leaders and experts, if you can do anything about that.
Well, well, just a plug for CHEUSE again. Part of the work that we're going to be doing as we open up this center is really developing curricular approaches for teachers, counselors, healthcare workers, et cetera, on ways to not necessarily be hip-hop, but utilize tools developed from hip-hop to be able to use in classrooms. And just really quickly, in my work, and 2 out of 3 of the folks here use it, but one person I know talks about it quite often, is really the art of the rap cipher as a healing space. And it's not hip-hop as in everybody must go in there and rap. But what hip-hop does through the cipher is it creates a social sphere where there are these norms that foster open spaces for dialogue. Essentially, if you have young people come in and position themselves in a circle and stand equidistant from each other, and one person is taking the helm of the conversation and they're freestyling an idea, once you put them in that space, it's a beautiful thing about hip-hop, they intrinsically know that, oh, this is a cipher. They know all the rules of engagement. They know how to interact with each other. And those are the spaces of vulnerability, even for the most hardcore rap artists, is when you get them in a cipher and they're freestyling, they're just coming off the top of the head, that's when their vulnerability is most expressed. And so we could bring those type of spaces into schools and clinics as well.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Braxton Sheldon. I'm a senior. I'm 17. I go to school at Walls in D.C. Hey. I'm a peer educator for Promising Futures. We'll be talking during a breakout session a little later. But I love everything you guys are talking about. I dig it. I'm the youth. Yeah, I understand. But I wanted to ask, Nas has a song lamenting the death of hip-hop, whereas Mos Def has a song saying that hip-hop is the way it is because we allow it to be so. What do you guys think of, like, the state of hip-hop in regards to, like, our complacency with it? Like, we tolerate it. So what do you think, like, the progression? How do you think we can, I guess, turn all rap into conscious rap? Like, do you get what I'm trying to say?
I'm going to just jump this really quick, and then I'll go to you guys. I think that I think all rap is conscious rap. And I think, you know, when we start making when we start putting criteria on the types of hip, like, you know, that's bad hip-hop, that's great hip-hop, That's not so good hip-hop. I think everything in life and any artifact that's created from a genuine place provides the opportunity for us to have a teaching moment or teachable moment. So I can listen to the most seemingly negative rap. Like, I mean, I've heard some, and I feel like I'm picking on Lil Wayne, and that's not true, but like I've heard some Lil Wayne lyrics where it's like, oh, did he just say that? But for young people who I know are already consuming it, I actually welcome that lyric in the classroom so we can have an active space for deconstructing it. So then that Lil Wayne lyric, even though it has a negative theme, becomes conscious hip-hop because of what I bring to it. And so I think that all hip-hop is conscious hip-hop. It depends on who is teaching it and how the criticalities develop from it. That's, one thing really quickly. And then second of all, and I'm going to go to Raheel because I know she has some insight on this for sure. The second thing is that when Nas says hip-hop is dead, or artists, or when people say I'm over hip-hop, it's frustration. It's not there saying, man, I'm over this artifact, because the artifact, the culture is not going anywhere. It's more often a truncated way to say I'm tired of what you've done to my culture. It's like when initially Kids in Harlem was like, man, I ain't shaking no more. And you're like, you're not shaking it? Because look what you've done to it. Exactly. So it's like, if you take my thing and make it something it's not supposed to be, then I'm going to say I'm tired of it. But the culture remains the same. Hip-hop is, we've named it hip-hop since '79, but hip-hop has existed, since slavery. So it can never be dead. Yeah.
So I'm just going to say that I want you all to practice good self-care. If you need to go to the ladies' room and the men's room, please get up and go. But I think this is such an excellent discussion that we can just have 2 minutes to then go into our 11 o'clock keynote speaker. But that means that you're obligated to stand up and say, excuse me, do your self-care, and then come back without the break. All right? Thank you.
So I would recommend Trisha Rose's Hip-Hop Wars.
Brilliant.
Brilliant book. But in the book, she talks about the myths surrounding hip-hop. And, I mean, what she really focuses on is the fact that, that there are corporations driving hip-hop now. So I think we have to be honest in saying that it's not this organic thing that's, being birthed in small communities like the South Bronx, giving voice to local issues. I mean, it's a corporate engine now. And I personally separate it out. I separate out what are very manufactured forms of hip-hop, where people are following a formula. Like, there's a beat, there's a bass, there's a hook, there's things that are going to get people going in a club. And there are certain lines, there are certain things you do in a video. It's a formula. And I don't call that progressive or conscious hip-hop, because for me, it does a disservice to artists like Kanon, artists like Lupe, artists who are really trying to use their hip-hop towards a progressive end. And I think it's really important to say that there's a tradition that this comes out of. There's a tradition of resistance, and if you can't claim hip-hop if you don't honor or know that tradition. So I think it's important. It's like when there was controversy over the new Black Panther Party during the Trayvon Martin protest, and the Black Panthers released an open letter, and they made a distinction. This is who we are. This is what we did, and that is not us. And so I think even within hip-hop, maybe there's an open letter that old school hip-hop writes to this form and says, well, this is what you've forgotten, And so I don't want to begin to promote censorship, but at the same time, this is one of the most powerful mediums in the world, and I don't think it's being used to its greatest capacity.
Really quickly, I just want people to understand that there is a difference between the industry and the culture. And I think that it's imperative that for young people, all of us, to maintain and continue to tell the story and live the culture, and stop looking to the industry for permission to exercise our inalienable God-given rights, because it's our culture. And so once you teach someone and show them the difference and explain to them the purpose and the plot behind the industry, then when you know you'll be able to better understand and navigate through that. Because there is just, I mean, I can say for you, I'm familiar with your organization, so Promise and Futures, there's a way that you go about educating that may be different than what people may deem traditional or norm, but you have a level of understanding where you know your facts, you know the truth, you can differentiate it, and we're just putting a creative spin on it. We need to do the same thing when people are coming up in hip-hop. I feel like we have to do a better job in promoting those artistic aesthetics. That from the message, you're right, because everything is conscious, because it came out of your state of consciousness. I might think you were unconscious, but it still was your conscious. But the artistic aesthetics is something that every other art form has, and we need to hold that within hip-hop. So it's like, okay, yes, this was your rap song, but aesthetically, it didn't reach the bar. Yeah, because I couldn't say I'm a jazz trumpeter or play this. You're a classical trumpeter. There are very clear benchmarks that you better not say I'm a classic trumpeter and then I'm just like and don't know what it is that I'm doing. So then don't tell me you're an MC if you can't meet what is that sphere or what makes you an MC. You may be an apprentice or you may be a newbie or in training. So I think we have to hold those standards.
How are we on time? Are we okay? Is it 6 minutes? I want to keep the tradition of the best on-time conference. You know, I'm just coming in for the first time, so I have to make sure I honor that. So,
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
I have a question. You touched on this in terms of the influence of the very powerful corporations that are behind a lot of the commercialized rap. Do you think that the recording industry and the radio stations, I'm not trying to put a blame here, I'm talking more about responsibility. Do you think they have a responsibility to play, say, not just Lil Wayne talking about women and drugs, but maybe Nas and Damien talking about the struggles that are facing America right now and talking about spirituality? I mean, it's almost something that makes my stomach churn to know that there are albums as good as Distant Relatives out there, and that I turn on my radio and what I have to hear is what's on the radio. And how do we change that? Can we put pressure in a way? Is there a way we can put pressure on? I mean, you talked about the community saying that we have these ideas of black masculinity or black femininity, and that this is what we want to see and what consumers in suburbia want to see, and that's the consumer's role and the artist's role. But what about the recording industry and the radio stations? What's their responsibility?
That's a very difficult question because they are obviously they're a business. And so a business is run to accumulate funds, and if the public is asking for a certain product, then they're going to produce that product. Now, is that right? In my opinion, no. And I think it is definitely hurting youth, especially if we're not able to carry constructive, critical conversations out into other spaces to deconstruct what we're hearing on a daily basis. So they do have a responsibility, but I don't know if they're 100% to blame either, because there's a whole world of people who are not engaging in conversations with youth on a daily basis that they could be engaging with in order to deconstruct some of the things that we are hearing on the radio.